Hello
Hi.
again. This is my third hour class. Guys, say hi.
Oh my gosh, you're so much more awake than the early morning class.
Yep. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started then. Catherine, come on up. Okay, so our first question is kind of three parts, so I'll read it a little slower. But so it's where did you find the inspiration for your books? Um, why did you choose to write about different countries instead of the United States? And then how did you decide on those specific countries?
Okay, got it. Um, so I often draw inspiration from news stories. Anything that talks about young adults, any issues facing young adults, pressures, trends, what have you, I find that interesting. But I think that to make those issues or those trends or what have you come alive, you want to see it from an individual character's point of view. So I read about cutting. I read about girls who self-injure a while ago. I don't self-injure. I'm too much of a chicken to ever actually hurt myself. But I was fascinated by this um, behavior, and I was fascinated by the fact that so many people were engaging in it. And so I did a lot of research about cutting, but it was really through telling the story of one girl who hurts herself that I feel like it opens up your heart, it opens up your curiosity and compassion in a way that reading about an issue doesn't. I think reading about any issue, climate change, gun safety, what have you, we get a little dulled, we get a little shut down and daunted and think, oh my gosh, the world is such a mess. There's so many things going on. I can't deal. But if you read about it from the point of view of one person who is affected by that issue or is involved in that issue, I think it changes things. So that's the way I write. As far as choosing books about other cultures and other countries, when I first heard about trafficking, I was introduced to people who worked in India and Nepal to fight trafficking. And I was aware then that those were two countries that had done a lot on the issue, whereas there are other countries that were lagging behind. So I knew that there would be people there to help me and get me into the brothels and get me up into the Himalayas to meet families who'd sold their children. And so I instantly went there. I could have, people from Latin America are trafficked, people from China, people from Eastern European countries are trafficked to the United States. It would actually have been harder to penetrate there and probably more dangerous because there's government involvement in the trafficking there. It's big time organized crime, and they don't respect the safety or the integrity of storytellers or journalists. People get killed nosing around in this kind of thing. So I chose those countries, and I chose Cambodia because of meeting Arn. I think it's really important when you are writing about a culture that's not your own to do as much research as you possibly can, to be deeply curious and respectful about something that you don't know anything about. To walk in as a white woman and say, yeah, I'm going to handle this. I know about it. I'm going to tell you what your life is like. That's really arrogant. So you have to be humble enough to say, I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I'm going to ask you dumb questions, but it's in the spirit of rendering your experience with complexity and authentically. I love the idea of going to another culture and bringing out a story. And by culture, it can be even a subculture like cutters. That's a culture all to its own. Bringing out a story that people otherwise don't know about, people who are outside that circle. To me, that's really thrilling. And it's amazing to find that schools and teachers will bring those books into the classroom because they're challenging books.
So you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but I have two more questions. How much research was involved in the writing process, and how much time did you spend in each countries? And then when you were in those countries, did you ever feel in danger when traveling to research?
Let's see, I did about 6 months of book research and online research before I went to any of the countries. Um, I tried to become an expert on those places. Then I spent about a month in the countries. Uh, in Cambodia, I was with Arn the whole time, so I never felt any danger. But I did have that experience of being with him and his friends in the car for hours at a time. They're all speaking a language I don't understand. They're playing music that's not my music, and I can't understand the lyrics. We'd get out at the market, and I couldn't read the signs. I didn't know how to buy an orange, So it was a great experience to be the minority, to be the newcomer in a community where I am illiterate. And it gives you perspective for people who come to our country wanting to start a new life and having such a hard time with the basic things that we take for granted. So that was not dangerous, but it was telling about being in a different culture. Then in India, unfortunately, I was harassed and followed and pinched and just harassed endlessly by men. There's an assumption if you're traveling by yourself, a woman traveling by herself is easy or is open to anybody's advances. You're unprotected because you're not with a man. That was upsetting. It made me angry. It was a little bit frightening at times. There was a situation where some guy pinched me and I yelled at him and all his friends gathered around, and that could have gotten ugly. But I was stupid to go to a country by myself. I should have brought a friend or a research assistant or my husband or somebody. I think the bigger problem in India was the emotional stress of interviewing people, girls who'd been sold at age 11, girls who'd been raped at 13, mothers who had sold their daughters not knowing what they were doing, carrying all that sadness, absorbing it. That took a toll on me. And so at night I would go back to my hotel room and I would just shake. I was so angry and I was so sad and depressed, and there was nothing I could do about it. And there wasn't anybody I could tell because I didn't want to call my family back in New York in the middle of the night and get them all worried. So I held that inside me and ended up feeling very depressed when I got home from India. It wasn't until I started writing the book and doing something about it that the depression started to lift.
Okay, let's talk about Never Fall Down. Yeah, you.
Okay, so how did you decide to write about the Cambodian genocide and not any other genocide? And how did you meet Arn and decide to write his story?
So I chose to write about the Cambodian genocide because of Arn. It was meeting him and understanding that he had a very important and powerful story to tell, and he couldn't do it himself. But he was too traumatized and didn't have the language skills to write his story. The Cambodian genocide, it's interesting that it's not better known. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is it's not better known in the U.S. because we had been in the war in Vietnam for however many years. And we dropped bombs all over Cambodia because we thought that Vietnamese soldiers were escaping into the Cambodian countryside. So our violence and our destruction of Cambodia destabilized the country and gave rise to the Khmer Rouge. So there's a sense of guilt and culpability that we don't want to look at, our role in that country. I think the other thing is people were really sick of Southeast Asia after Vietnam was over, and so we didn't want to look at it. And the Cambodians themselves have a difficult time talking about what happened. It's not like the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, where the survivors were so clearly victims because of something they could not change or didn't want to change or disavow, their religion. It was done to them by Hitler. And we can all agree what a bad person he was. So those survivors can talk somehow about their experiences in a way that the people from Cambodia have a much more difficult time. It was Cambodians doing this to other Cambodians. The people who did survive often had to do terrible things to survive. They had to make common cause with the Khmer Rouge. There's also a different ethic in that country where people don't share their dirty laundry, their bad news, their secrets. They put more, I mean, this is a generalization, of course, but there's more of an emphasis on putting on a facade that says everything's okay. And if I have that facade, then everything will be okay. That there's a shame attached to talking about what happened to them. And that's kind of what makes Arne special. One of the things that makes him special is that he understood that this story that resided in him was haunting him, was eating him up, and that he had to tell it to be free from it. And I was fortunate enough to meet him and create a relationship with him.
So our next question is about Arne's dialect. What inspired you to write Never Fall Down through Arne's dialect? And was it ever hard to stay true to his thought process?
I tried writing the book in, plain standard English, and it didn't sing. It was very flat. And I went back to listening to the tapes of Arne, and I thought, he's got such a funny, mischievous, winning, adorable voice. Why don't I just get out of the way and let him tell the story? And I think there's something about the way he uses words that is poetic. And it's because it's more improvised. He's putting together the English that he learned late in life with the syntax from his native language of Khmer. And I just thought it's a brutal story. If you have this kind of charming, innocent narrator whispering in your ear, practically taking you along on the story, that it might be more bearable that way. I think it's hard for readers. I understand that the first couple pages are weird. Like, what? I don't get this. But if you allow yourself the freedom to go with this weird, unfamiliar to us way of speaking, I think you warm up to it. Staying in his perspective ended up being kind of easy because I'd spent so much time with him. I could close my eyes and hear that voice. And if I didn't know how he felt about something, I'd write it in. I'd, imagine what I thought it was, and then show it to him, and he would say, yeah, that's right, or no, not quite like that. So it was very much a collaboration in that way.
We have another question that is, what was the most difficult scene to write in Never Fall Down? And was there a part of Arne's story that you felt was too traumatic to share in the book?
The worst scene, the hardest one to write is when he kills the little baby monkey in the jungle. And it's interesting because there are a lot worse things that happen in that book. But there was something about that pivot from a moment where he is receiving affection, feeling playful, connecting to this group of monkeys. He's so lonely, he's so isolated, he's lost, he's hungry, he's feverish, and all of a sudden he encounters these monkeys, and he has a beautiful light moment where he can be experienced the full range of human emotions that had been tamped down during the Khmer Rouge time. So he's got this little monkey on his chest, and you can feel its heart beating, and you're just like, oh, what a relief, finally comfort for this poor boy. And then the monkey's turn to leave, and in an instant, he goes from being a full human being to this depraved human being who has to kill that monkey to survive, to eat. So I thought that was especially brutal because it showed how low he would have to sink, and that he felt like an animal in that moment. There's nothing left out in the book. Arn was very clear. He never said to me, don't put that in, I'm too embarrassed. He wanted a full confession, and he wanted to be fully accountable for what he'd done, and he wanted other people, Cambodians in particular, who read it, to also feel free to talk about what happened, both what was done to them and what they did. And I think we can all apply a different moral, ethical standard to behavior that a child might undertake when he's at, the point of a gun. But with the Khmer Rouge, he's already seen them kill other people. The things that you might do in those circumstances that you would never do in your normal life. I think that's why we like reading books like The Hunger Games. There are choices that those characters have to make to survive that they wouldn't do that in real life. But we understand and even applaud with some of the choices that they make. Especially if they act with kindness or decency. I think we like to read those books because we wonder, well, who would I be if all of a sudden, our country was at war, or I was chosen to kill? Would I be a coward? Would I be brave? Would I do the right thing? Fortunately, we don't have to face those dilemmas, but I think in books you get to look at those kinds of questions.
So my question is, how did your perspective of Cambodia change after you researched and wrote the book?
So my image of Cambodia was stuck in time. I thought it was like year zero, as it is described in the book. The Khmer Rouge really turned the clock back in Cambodia, made it into a very primitive culture. There were, no money, no education, no individual identity. They killed all the lawyers, most of the doctors, most of the teachers, most of the musicians. So the country had lost its educated class and had become completely equal as peasants, or that was the theory anyhow. I was really surprised when I got to Cambodia and saw that Phnom Penh is a very vibrant modern city with lots of young people riding on their mopeds, going to work, going out in the evenings. There's a real baby boom after a genocide or a war as a culture replaces all those people who were lost. And those young people are very forward thinking. They don't want to look back at the past. They might not even know about it. And so there's a vibrancy in the cities. But in this countryside, there's terrible, terrible poverty still.
All right, guys, let's switch gears and talk about soul. Amanda?
All right, so what made you decide to write Sold in a vignette format?
I did that in part because it was hard to write, and I could only write little bits at a time. I couldn't stay with it for very long because it was depressing. It also allowed me an artistic freedom to use more graceful language to tell the story. So if I thought up to myself, I only have a paragraph. How can I use the best word and nothing more to tell this? Don't go on and get all windy and long-winded and in love with your own writing. Just tell it simply and spare in the voice of this girl. I think it was easier for readers to have that white space around each of the vignettes, that you can kind of catch your breath and go, okay, all right, that was tough, but I can read the next one and the next one and the next one. I also think it invites the reader to bring his or her imagination into the story. Since I don't tell you absolutely everything, I'll give you one incident of this experience and one of that, and you can add what you think might be happening in the meantime. It also allowed me to shift gears from a really upsetting vignette where something really terrible happens to something sweet or kind, like when Harish does something funny, and all of a sudden it lifts Lakshmi out of her despair. If you have to build an entire chapter where this change happens and she, goes from despair to some hope, it's a little harder in a way. Whereas if you just end one vignette and then go to the next one and show the change of mood, I think it's more efficient in a way. It's more realistic, because I think it is a very fragmented experience, having your reality messed with like that 1 minute life could be really not worth living, and the next minute somebody does something so kind to you that you think, oh, okay, I'm not invisible, I'm not worthless. So it allowed for putting tension between those two incidents quickly.
What was your biggest concern while you were writing about human trafficking?
My biggest concern was that nobody would read this book, that it would be banned or censored, that it would be perceived as too dark, that it would just be drowned out by all the vampire books in the world, that parents would object to it, or that teachers would say, I'm not going to bring that into my classroom. That's too tricky. I'm going to get in trouble, or whatever. And so fortunately, there are more teachers like your teacher who are willing to bring this book into the classroom and have faith in young adult readers, that you are compassionate, you are activist, you are interested in the fate of kids around the world. So I guess that was my biggest fear, and it didn't come true.
So this is about education. What role does education play in the probability of being trafficked?
Great question. I think that's really key, that education can mean, learning to read and write and add and subtract and read good literature, and that kind of education that fortunately you guys are enjoying. That is the kind of thing that lifts people out of poverty. And poverty is at the root of trafficking, that people are so desperate. All they can do is plant their crops, weed their crops, harvest their crops, cook their crops, and start all over again. Like they have no opportunity to get beyond subsistence living. All their energy is used up in just feeding themselves and keeping a roof over their heads. So your point is a good one, that education is the thing that will allow people to get job skills or work outside the home, have cash, earn money that creates a better standard of living. But then there's the kind of education that has more to do with awareness, that this can happen because people are isolated and no one treats them with seriousness or care or respect. And they don't know that when a stranger comes to town and offers a job that's too good to be true, that they're actually being fooled. So it's really all about sharing information, whether it's, conventional classroom style information or just the information that people need to know to live safely.
Chris?
yourself to be an anti-trafficking advocate?
Great question. I do. I mean, I was very moved by what I saw and wanted to help people one by one, but I couldn't. We never can. What I can do is use the talent and the opportunities that I have in publishing to raise awareness, to create the kind of education that we were just talking about. I choose my projects with care. If I'm going to spend 2 years on something, I really want it to be about something. I want to be part of the change. And some of the proceeds from this book always go to the agencies that helped me. So I do consider myself an advocate, but not full time. So I'll work on a book about child trafficking, and I'll work on the Never Fall Down, and help to raise awareness of the importance of the arts in Cambodia, and share some of those proceeds. So I'm not a one issue person, but I do love the opportunity that I have to use my art, to help create change and awareness.
Why did you choose to leave Sold so open-ended?
It was a conscious choice. I had written more, and my editor said, no, it ends just at that moment when she takes the first step toward her freedom. That if you leave it there, people will stay involved in the story. Their imagination will engage in, well, what does happen to her after this? I wanted it to be an uncomfortable ending that bothered you, because it should bother us what's happening. So I wrote about her getting out and getting a bath and a clean dress and getting an HIV test, but it wasn't very lively. The writing I was resolving what I needed to resolve for myself to feel better. But the truth is that these stories do not have happy endings. There's some girls who get rescued before they get sick, and they live in these shelters, and they get job skills. They learn to sew or to do hair or to make paper. They learn some sort of a skill so that they can be economically independent, because they're not welcome back in their villages. They're not wanted at home again. There's a disgrace. There's a fear that they have HIV. So they have to expect to live an independent life, not dependent on a man or on being married. Many of them do end up getting married. If they're healthy, they just decide, this happened to me. It was not my fault. Why should I sideline myself in life? And they go on to have fuller lives. I think they're still traumatized. I think they still have difficulties, but it's amazing that a culture that doesn't really do therapy, where we believe that if you talk something out, you can conquer it. In a culture where there really isn't psychotherapy, often the belief is, if you just store this away, it doesn't have power over you.
So this next question is about people's reactions to the stories, and have you ever gotten any pushback regarding your portrayal of the Khmer Rouge and or the sex traffickers?
I haven't. There are people who will say to me, why are these kids' books? What are you doing to the youth of America? But I think the youth of America is a lot smarter than people think. Let's see. The only pushback I got, and it is deserved, is that in Sold, it's a white hero. The white man comes in and rescues the dark-skinned girl. When I was writing the book, that was what was happening. The rescues were being done by Americans. That has changed. Now it's being done by people in those countries. So if I had it to do over again, I would write about the local people doing this work. I was aware, though, that I was mostly writing for an American audience, and that it wouldn't hurt to have a character that white American readers, I shouldn't say white, probably just American readers, could identify with and say, oh, that could be me. I could be part of the solution in some way. So that was a choice that I made at the time. Things have changed. If I had to write the book today, I would definitely change that.
Okay, our next question is, do you still stay in contact with anyone you met in your research?
I'm always in contact with Arn. I see him a couple times a year when he comes to the United States. The girls from the brothels, not really. The book was translated into Hindi and Nepali, and the girls said it was a very accurate and truthful rendering of their experience, and they loved the idea that it was a book, that they were not invisible to the world, that they were not forgotten. And I stay in touch with the people who helped me do the research.
It's about future writing plans. Are there any other global issues that you're interested in writing about? Do you have any plans for another book?
Wow. I am interested in anything that affects young people around the world. So I'm very interested in the refugee crisis and the refugee movement and the experience of people who, through no fault of their own, are pushed out or have to leave their home countries and find themselves in another place that's sometimes hostile, sometimes welcoming. And what is it like to try to make your way in a whole new world? I'm interested in child labor. I'm interested in kids who work in the factories in China, making the sneakers and the phones that we use. But I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do next. I've been working on a memoir since writing Malala's book. I've been working on just telling my own story for a while and see how that feels.
So, as a writer, what do you hope readers will take away from your books?
You know, I don't have a specific agenda, and I don't think that it makes for a good read if you feel like the author is trying to tell you something or preach or want you to come away with a certain lesson, especially for young adults. People are always telling you guys what you're supposed to do. My sense is I feel very respectful of your ability to read the facts, read the story, make your own decisions based on what you see and how you take it in. That said, I do think that there's a through line in my books that isn't conscious. It's kind of accidental. You don't realize it until you look back and you say, oh, there's a similarity in all these books. And that is, it's about people telling their own stories. That the idea is, once you can tell your own story, once you can take it out of the dark, if it's something you're ashamed of, or embarrassed about, or you think you're the only one, if you take it out and share it and put it out there, you find there's no reason to be ashamed or embarrassed and that you're not the only one. And I think there's a lot of healing in telling stories. So I think that's the, message of the books, even though it was never intentional.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to talk to you again in the fall.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.